figure out what does Black liberation look like in the spaces in which they work. I'm always grateful to be in spaces with them, and I learn as much from them as I try to give. So as I look to the field of work and I look at the folks I get to work with and all of the amazing work that you all do each and every day, I wonder, with all of this heart and soul, with all of the vision and energy and the relentless drive for justice and equity, what's holding us back? We know that it's money and time and resources. Yes to all of those things. But I also want to explore something else with you today. A different question about what holds back progress. And the question I want to explore with you all today is, what are we designing for? Are we designing for comfort, or are we designing for progress? And let me tell you why I use those two words. In the years and years I've been doing human rights work and equity work, I've been starting to sense in recent years that our work is actually creating a movement that's a little bit too tender. It's a little bit too hesitant. It's too centered on those who need to be kept comfortable. The biggest part of my work, day in and day out, is helping manage people's discomfort around racial equity, not actually advancing the strategies. And I'm observing that progress is obstructed by comfort. We're willing to trade our own progress to keep some people comfortable, to keep systems comfortable. And I don't mean progress at the margins and that fits into a pilot project. I mean the kind of progress that's sustained, not a flash in the pan, not a headline. Progress that is healing, not traumatizing. Progress that can be joyful and liberating to our work. And joyful in the sense that we're filled with more energy, more readiness. Beyond happy, beyond feeling good, joyfulness can expand our capacity. That's the kind of progress that we're talking about. The kind where we know we're not taking 10 steps backwards, where we're not trying to go back to just where we were last year and we have slow-moving conversations. I mean the kind of progress that we know is embedded in sustained change, in which you see a movement growing. I also just want to name comfort and healing are two different things. Healing can be uneasy. It can be challenging, but it ultimately serves to make us more whole, to make us more authentic and more at peace. Healing, in and of itself, is a form of justice and liberation. Comfort, on the other hand, may have nothing to do with healing. Comfort literally means to be free of unease. So let me share a few thoughts about what comfort looks like in our work and how it holds us back. Comfort in the setting of justice and equity is largely defined as creating polite, nice, orderly spaces. Comfort works in the world of appropriate, the place in which we're often policing the very identities of those around us, sometimes our own selves. We police language, we police what professionalism looks like, we police what leadership looks like. When we're working in spaces of upholding comfort and the status quo, it can look like this. We do the work to accommodate and assimilate into the norms and rules of a system we inherited, a system we know that's divorced from the work of justice, equity, and liberation, as if it was our only fate. It's a system that people of many beautiful colors, indigenous people, and our allies were not part of building. In spaces of comfort, racial equity work is often on the defense. We're asked to ensure that it matters to the bottom line, that we fit it into short agendas or one-day trainings. We're asked to make sure that the work of racial equity isn't mission creep. We get so busy in our day-to-day work that we forget doing racial equity work is actually about using our imagination, about thinking differently. And we get so busy that we don't even have time to do it. And let me just offer that the greatest opportunity for collective good and social innovation is anti-racism work. We often design for managing resistance instead of rewarding action. When we do the work of comfort, we pathologize indigenous people, people of many beautiful colors, and those who have been given marginalized identities, as if the problem is inherent with the people themselves, with the communities themselves. We exempt the system from implication. For example, we say, that's a vulnerable community we serve, instead of saying, this is a community made vulnerable by systemic racism. We create safe space. We create safe space, not brave space. Space that's designed to minimize discomfort, to meet people where they are. Please don't say that anymore. This is a space largely defined by the norms and values of centered whiteness. But we often forget to meet the needs of those who live the experiences every single day of injustice, oppression, and inequity. We forget to design for those people who are out in front clearing pathways for others to show up in doing this work. In spaces of comfort, we get preoccupied with DEI, as if that is now one word. And usually we get stuck on the diversity part. But comfort, when we do that work, it means we're not actually centering conversations about anti-racism, anti-white supremacy, and power asymmetry. I mean, when we design for comfort, we actively censor ourselves and hold back essential information for fear of discomfort. When I work with clients, my day-to-day work is as a coach and facilitator around racial justice and equity work. And I will tell you, every time we're setting up these workshops, the number one question I get, can we talk about anti-white supremacy work later? We're not ready for that. Can we talk about whiteness later and what power and privilege looks like, maybe in a few months? We censor ourselves to keep some people comfortable. We're hesitant to name the ways in which we inherited a system of domination that's race-based, and that it was designed for the very reasons of oppression, hierarchy, and othering. When we do the work of comfort, we get fixated on things like perfection, efficiency, strategic plans, individualism, and pilot studies. We study, we report, and we crunch data until we don't even remember the question we were trying to better understand. Designing for comfort means we hold whiteness and the current power structure to a low standard of effort and showing up in order to keep it content and at ease. And if I may share a few words about what I just said in terms of the language, when I say the words racial equity, this is what I really mean. I mean belonging. Yes, racial equity is about closing the disparities. It is about opening up access, but that's not all it is. That's a component of doing racial equity work. Racial equity work is actually about having the power to self-determine and express your own life the way you choose. It's about expressing the fullness of your own identity. Racial equity is actually about creating space for more than one way of doing life. And that's what we need to remember when we say racial equity. It's not about disparity. It's about creating more space for all of the ways of doing our work in life. It means we can conduct our work and ourselves, our expression, beyond the constraints of a white, cisgendered, heteronormative, Christian, wealthy male identity. And a word about whiteness. We're all implicated. It doesn't matter your identity. Whiteness is the water in which we all swim. It refers to the norms, the beliefs, the practices that were intentionally designed by colonizers to uphold a specific kind of normalized identity as ideal and as right. We are all implicated for different reasons and with different practices, but no one is exempt from the work of whiteness. It's our shared inheritance. And so when we understand that comfort is something we're all implicated in, and it's one way to understand the status quo and how we've been designing our movement in racial equity, what would it look like if we were designing for progress? What does it look like when we are intentional about the progress we aim to make? First, progress means we open up spaces at our edges of the comfort zones we live in, where we can reimagine how we live together, how to co-create a world in which we all thrive and celebrate the many ways of doing life. Progress, when we're doing this work for belonging and justice, We're asked to be the edge walkers, not the comfort keepers. We go from waiting to doing. We're the ones who do the work of creating a new normal. Progress means we live in the space where our collective imagination is bold and it's unflinching, because it's not about comfort, it's about progress. I want to offer that in this space of progress, there's actually immense joy and a feeling of strength and lightness. It's expansive space, it's not limiting. It's not a zero-sum game when you do the work of progress. It's creative, it's boundless, and it's nourishing work. The work of progress for justice and equity is liberating, because the work of progress is truly the work of humanity. Here are some of the essential pillars for designing for progress. First, challenge the norms of where permission comes from. Essential practice in designing for progress is undoing what we believe permission to challenge the status quo looks like. You know, I often see staff in organizations, no matter the level, waiting for the strategic plan to be approved, for someone with authority or a certain kind of title to allow for the work of equity to unfold, to be named as a priority or to be given the definition of here's what racial equity means. Often people are waiting for a certain kind of readiness. Are we ready? Did we learn enough? Is it the right moment? Do we have enough of all the right things in place? And they wait before they take action. I want to challenge these norms of permission and to challenge the idea that it takes formal authority and power to take action. I offer instead that permission comes from bearing witness. When you bear witness to injustice, to suffering, to oppression, you have been given permission to do this work. When we have seen suffering and pain, heard stories of strife and trauma, when we are actually receiving a request from those we are in space with, we're receiving a request to show up, to take action, to play a role in the healing. That is permission. And frankly, permission, we did a board and a staff training. And then I asked, how did you demonstrate that you care today? What is the action you took today to demonstrate you care about racial equity? And it's about that quiet. Because we don't know actually how to translate that caring beyond our own comfort zone for progress. We sit in that space of comfort so deeply that we actually can't translate it into the work of progress. So we have to ask ourselves, how do you show up for progress instead of your own comfort? In designing for progress, consider a new way of looking at placemaking as revitalizing the human spirit and connection. I know the arts and language and identities is such a central part of creating place and space for people. How are the spaces that are being built, created, and fixed demonstrating the deepest roots of belonging? Do they conform to plans and budgets and profits, or do they presence the personalities of those who live there first? Does placemaking lift up wholeness? How can placemaking heal the wounds of oppression? Fourth, be a truth asker. Before we can do the work of truth telling about power, inequities, and injustice, we need to do a better job of asking honest questions. Truth askers are willing to take on the role of investigator, explorers. They're the ones willing to sit in that space of courage and bravery to ask a different kind of question about what's happening in the decision-making process, in the project planning, and how communities are being engaged. Truth asking requires us to examine the roots where radical truth lives. We seek to better understand, who are we serving? Really, who are we serving? Who benefits? And who benefits beyond that? Whose comfort or healing are we working towards? How am I shifting my power and our power? What am I withholding? And the best question ever, why do we do it this way? Who taught us to do it this way? Is there another way of doing life here? Another way of doing work? When you do the truth asking, You open up a whole new world of questions and analysis. Truth asking is such a critical part of this work. I often hear, you know, Bina, I'm going to this board meeting and I'm really struggling because I'm not sure that this is going to be well received. This work does not have to be confrontational. It has to be inquisitive about the systems we inherited and the constraints we're working towards. Don't assume we know what's happening. Question it. Suspend the belief that things have to be the way they are, that meetings have to be run the way they are, that power has to look the way it does, and that you have to comfort it the way you've been taught. You don't. Ask new questions. Next, design your work to meet the needs of people of many beautiful colors first. Design your work to meet the needs of Indigenous people and their aspirations. Design your work to meet the vision of those who have been given a marginalized identity first. Imagine, where can we open up space for people of many beautiful colors to show up as they determine? How do we prioritize their needs, their timelines, and their own Indigenous practices, their cultural practices of being in space together? Who are we comforting and who are we centering? Who is being asked to bear the burden? And lastly, you know, we are talking about systems change and how we make progress in them. Systems change. There's books and all the things written on it. Here's what it's really about. They are big structures, and it's intimidating to try to change them. They're complex, and it can feel like there's no amount of money, time, staff, resources, ideas to actually substantively move them to the work of justice and equity. But here's the antidote to when you're feeling overwhelmed in these big systems and when change feels so hard. The antidote to feeling like you're stuck on systems change, find the humans in the system. Systems and their institutions are demonstrations of rooted values and beliefs that are replicated until they appear normal and inevitable. That is, we systematize our values. That's how systems come to be. Institutions signal their values and their virtues and their actions and strategies. What are your institutions telling the world about what you believe is possible? About where you're situated and what you believe communities can be. What is your institution telling about how it values the people it serves? So ask when you're up to systems change, where are the humans in this system and what can we observe about what they believe? When we humanize systems, we find patterns of cultural norms and values. We see the repeated behaviors that start to create the norms of the system and institutions. And we can begin to see that actually changing policy is not the end of systems change. And it's actually not the solution to justice and equity work. And the civil rights movement is a great example of that. The environmental movement is a great example of that. We have policy after policy after policy, and look at what you all have to spend your time doing every day. We still have redlining, we still have oppression, we still have mass incarceration, we still have wage gaps, we still have people of colors dying at higher rates because of health issues. Policy change is not the same as systems change. The deepest form of systems change requires engagement at cultural levels, at the root cause of what people believe. Systems change work means we include the human element of beliefs and values front and center as part of our work. That means we have to do the work to normalize different norms and values. So I want to take just a couple of moments to focus on you, the individual, around where you show up and how to help move your work forward around progress. So here's the first thing. Purpose first and purpose always. Invest in understanding and knowing and internalizing your purpose. You know, when the work gets extra hard, when it's even more urgent and more resistance shows up, purpose will keep you going. It will help you focus. When you're called to action on any number of things, and let's be clear, you cannot turn on the news these days without being exhausted in about 15 seconds and thinking, now what do I do? And you still have to go to work, right? That's a big task. Purpose will help you focus. When board members who are much taller than me show up and they tower over me at meetings during racial equity retreats and at the breaks, and they're interrogating my credentials and my right to say what I am saying, when they're interrogating that I should even be in that room to be doing a training, that I should feel privileged to be in the space of those board members. When folks I work with tell me how progressive they are, but then they show me and tell me that they're unwilling to do any work to reimagine how they do their work. When people tell me, we need a business case for this racial equity work we're going to do, as if it is okay to commodify the work of oppression and liberation. When trauma, fear, anger, and exhaustion show up for me, I have to tell you, it's digging into my purpose that keeps me steady in those moments, in which I understand that the work of power and asymmetry there, that the work of othering and exclusion, not on my watch. I will be there for a purpose that's bigger than who I am. Deeply knowing purpose puts me in relationship with those who have come before me and those I am in service to now and in the future. Purpose is not the same as your passion. Purpose is not self-serving and it's not individual, but it can be healing. Purpose is the healing force of being an instrument, of being of service to those you are in relationship with. Purpose for the work of equity and justice is being in the collective. So ask yourself, what am I compelled to do in this work for justice for the collective? Next, decolonize your work. So we have to dehabituate from the idea of how we do our work, how we see the world, how we problem solve, how we engage in each other, how we solve conflicts, can only be this certain way in which we experience it now. There are so many other ways to decolonize our work and understand how other cultures, indigenous people, our ancestors did all of these things. To decolonize our work means we're not only looking at the outcome of our efforts, but we're looking at the methods as well. In order to get equitable and inclusive outcomes, you need to get equitable and inclusive processes in place. Our work is not to create the conditions of individual wins or becoming the leader and go-to organization on racial equity. That's not our work. Our work here is to create the conditions of a collective movement in which all of us can show up, and we're doing that in harmony with one another. That's where the work is. As part of decolonizing this work, I also need to name that we need to undo the narrative that this work of racial equity, DEI, racial justice, inclusion, whatever you want to call it, that it's uncomfortable. It's not. It's not uncomfortable for many of us who hold marginalized identities, and it doesn't have to be uncomfortable for anyone. We need to undo that narrative and put in place that this work is necessary and non-negotiable to get the outcomes we want for communities. It's liberating, healing, joyful work to be free of those constraints. When you get to be the creative extremists, in the words of MLK, to be in service to a new future and generations to come. It's amazing when you get to choose that you don't have to be a gatekeeper of the status quo. So ask yourself, where do you want to spend your precious energy, day after day? Being a gatekeeper or an edge walker? This work requires courage, and it can take us to our edges, but that's exactly what progress means, that we're at the space where we can expand and grow. So lastly, take care of yourselves and your colleagues. We need you to come back, right? Resilience means you come back to serve your purpose within the collective. We need you as leaders, as elders, as helpers, healers, truth askers, as allies, accomplices, and agitators. We need you in this work. But there's no need to show up at the expense of your well-being. Oppression and injustice works best when we work in ways that are unhealthy and that cause burnout, that cause us to be distracted from our purpose in the collective. As a practice of your own equity work, your own justice work, be well. So in closing, just a few words of encouragement. First, breathe. You want to take a breath. a lot of stuff going on. And second, because systems are actually humanized, and because the systems are not neutral, they're active all the time. And either they will be active for justice or they will perpetuate injustice actively. Systems are not neutral. It means you have a chance right now, every day, to change the system. You're empowered in the system already when you implicate yourself, when you understand that your own values show up in the system. It means we have the space and power and influence to change the system. The opportunities are in front of us every day to do this work. I promise you, the work of justice will not show up as a headline. It will not show up as your strategic plan or in your annual report. It is going to show up in the everyday choices you make to demonstrate an observable practice to justice, equity, and inclusion, to anti-racism work, to anti-power asymmetry work, to anti-white supremacy work. That's how systems change. When you make a choice every day to walk more purposefully, to be a truth asker and a truth teller, to be an edge walker and a bold thinker. We're empowered every day to choose, to be intentional about designing for progress or defaulting to our comfort zones. It means the moment to take action, to be creative and move forward with bold imagination will be right here, right now, today, and tomorrow, and the next day. So feel the power in this room. Imagine what happens when 250 people are willing to stand up and be edge walkers, to bring forward that new vision, to ask a new question in a meeting. Imagine what happens when everybody in this room chooses to shine a light on the default practices of comfort and the status quo, and instead says, we're going to choose progress and purpose today. You have infinite possibility to redesign the system right now. I know that in this room are the healers that we need. In this city are the healers we all need. I know the edge walkers are in here because I know some of y'all. I know the people are in this room who are willing to help us heal the disease of standard operating procedures. I know we can each reconnect with that place in us that's full of love and imagination. So let's become more intentional about conducting ourselves with humanity. It's time to serve something beyond our own comfort and be courageous about the work of progress. Thank you.
I'm going to give a quick thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. You want me to?
You said your microphone works best if you're on the other side.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Thank you, Bina.
Yes.
This journey of racial equity and inclusion work has been varied. It has been scary at times. But I promise to be an walker if you promise to be an walker with me.
Nice.
Thank you. We have time for some questions. There is a microphone over there, so if you have a question, raise your hand. If you have a loud voice, go ahead and just shout your question out. Questions? Down front.
Wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
How do you get the people who are not in the room to buy into it?
Yes. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. No? I was going to try to walk around. It's my dance. Maybe that mic's not on. Okay. So the question was, how do you get folks who aren't here? So maybe if I frame that as folks who show up in resistance, who are unwilling. So the first thing is I want to say that's actually what I mean by creating a collective movement. That's the work. That's where we have to focus more of our energy on creating those relationships and alliances. So the first thing I say is, one, if you are a person of a many beautiful colors identity, choose your battles wisely, right? These are different equations for those of us who are Black, brown, indigenous. So that's the first thing. If you hold a white identity, you just need to go for it. Yeah, so just like get in there. This like, I'm not sure, just no. You don't get the same question. So that's part one. I think the piece here is that we need to start not necessarily meeting people where they are, but starting where they are. So I mean, having a conversation with them to build a relationship. And in the spaces I work, I ask lots of questions. So when I get that resistance of like, yeah, no, I don't think we have time to do this, Bina, and we're going to bump that racial equity part to the bottom of the agenda, you know, I'll try to find ways to ask new questions about what is it in your experience that makes it okay to respond this way, right? What is it that would make you more comfortable in showing up at the next step? The other thing I just want to offer, and there's so much to be said about bringing resistors with us, one is that incremental action is transformative. So sometimes this work feels like we're asking people to give up too much, right? We're not asking anyone to give up anything, so that's just one. It's about sharing. But you know, recently I was doing a training and the CEO was in the back of the room and he kind of leaned back and did that thing where he looked at me like sideways. And he said, you know, Bina, you're really asking a lot of us. And I was like, really? This feels like a lot? I'm just starting. It's like 10 a.m. We're here till 5 o'clock, friend, right? And so this idea of like what a lot looks like, what it means to give, we have to reimagine that. And so I asked him, what is it that feels so hard? What is it that makes this moment differently than all the other times you think you show up with all the power that you can't do it now? So that was another question. And I asked him, instead of trying to deliver the world, trying to blow up the Death Star, trying to do the big thing, what's one thing you can do today? What's the next incremental step you can take to show up for this work? And it changed the conversation because he had a sense of empowerment that he could play a role. The very last thing on one is sometimes you have to cut the leash. Look, some people are going to be resistors and they will obstruct. The more you try to build a relationship with them, the more actively they will oppose you, right? And in those cases, choose your battles. There are many times I've been in places where it's like, not today. Like, this lady is not my work today, right? Like, I have been in many spaces where it's like, this is not my ethical battle to fight. Like, it's not my job to fix this person. Right? So I do try to find those channels of questions and relationship building, trying to do the reimagination piece. Like, what would it look like if we did this? Just on a piece of paper. You don't have to write it down in stone. Just think with me. And when those folks say, no, thank you, it's like, I see them. I see them. So they're not my work. I try to center on the folks who are ready to go. I think there are more of us of all colors, all ethnicities, all spaces, who want to do this work. I actually think there are not so many people left who think it's uncomfortable. They just don't know how to show up. So we have to give some space to that. So in my work, I try to focus on those people who are in front, who have demonstrated they're willing and ready to learn and try, instead of getting sucked into the 2 or 3 or 5 resistors, because that's how white supremacy works. Get distracted. Pay attention over here. And everyone who's ready to go, everyone who's ready to work, everyone who's ready to throw down for this, no resources, no support, no coaching, no healing. So I try to focus in a different place. Thank you. There's a question down here. Are you all freezing? It's freezing up here. Dang. Morning.
Hey, good morning.
Hey.
I just wanted to say that that was amazing.
Thank you.
My question is centered around, I think, realistic objectives. And so when we talk about the issue of racial inequity and injustice, there are clear signs that are physical that you can see, such as disparities of wealth. And I think that one of the biggest parts of bridging the gap between the two is to actually realize and find out ways to deal with it. What are more concrete ways of dealing with the realistic and apparent disparities that we have?
Dang. Wow, y'all are bright-eyed and bushy-tailed this morning. Another big question. So a few thoughts came to mind. One is, I think we need to be better in the data presentations and analysis of where the structural challenge came to the disparity. What's driving it? So again, you know, we often talk about in this neighborhood, here are the education outcomes, the home ownership outcomes, the wealth accumulation outcomes, but we fail to implicate the system in it. So we don't put it in context around the reason this is happening is because the system privileges this other community. Because the system was designed to handle property taxes in this way. And here's the code for that. Here's the policy decision for that, right? So we often fail to put data in context. If there's one thing I can just offer on data, I was in a room in Madison, Wisconsin, where there was a panel talking about how Madison was the best place to live in America, which I feel like almost every city gets this at some point, but neither here nor there. I mean, San Diego is pretty dope, so there's that. But so there was this panel and they're like, Madison's amazing, et cetera. So there were several of us who were thinking like, for who? Like who is this for? Who is this city amazing for? Detroit has the same, up and coming, for who? Right? And so we asked some questions about, you know, how did this engage different communities of colors? What did that look like, et cetera? And there weren't great answers around the data analysis. So that was one. But the other thing that was happening, I just want to point to something that came to mind when you asked that around the tangible part, is the intangible part that upholds the system. So as this panel unfolded, there were several of us people of colors who were sitting together in this very tight room. It was jam-packed listening to this, and slide after slide came up around this issue of health disparities. So at the same time they were talking about it's a great place to live, this other panelist talked about health disparities. And it just talked about Black women experience X and young Black children experience Y. And this woman spoke up and she said, that's me and my family. Stop it. The pathologizing in that room caused so much trauma, right? And she's like, that's my life. That is my family. That's my mother. That's us. And you don't implicate yourself anywhere. You didn't talk about the system that made that happen. You're talking about it as if that data comes from me. So I just want to name that kind of the piece of how we frame inequities and how we use data needs to be put into the system. It needs to implicate the system and policies and be named. We also have to understand that doing racial equity work, when you're looking at systems, there are not separate systems. There's different systems for like education and housing and so on, but the system is one system that privileges at the expense of oppression. They are the same system. So this idea that there's like a normal system and then there's a broken system is untrue. It's not broken. This is what white supremacy and oppression does. This is how it works. It's one system. So the idea of like, well, I didn't ask for this privilege. It's just how the system works. Yeah, totally. This is how the system works. It's the same one that's breaking it for everybody else. Yeah? There's a workshop that will have more time to go into this, so we can kind of dive deeper if you want to attend that. I'd love to talk more about that. Thank you. Questions? Do we have time? We have a couple more minutes. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yes, good question. So the question was, how do we listen to Mother Nature and that the needs around aligning the environmental movement to the social justice sector? Is that a fair summary? Yeah. You know, a big part of my work is actually with the environmental movement, EJ groups, and conservation, all in different parts of the spectrum on environment. And it's interesting. The first is, I think we have not done a good job in the white environmental field understanding how it came to be. So the environmental field around restoration and protection actually was a form of racism. It was no one on this land, period. Which means our indigenous ancestors were forcibly removed in order for white people to say, we want to protect this land. So that's the first thing. There needs to be a reckoning to understand what the policy implications are now over history, because the same thing is happening. The second thing is that the white environmental movement largely stripped indigenous knowledge, and I mean both capital I and small I indigenous, people of colors, from the knowledge they had about stewarding the land. We know this to be true, is there were practices of stewardship, and then white people showed up for the movement and they were like, no thank you, we're gonna do it this way. So I think we need to go back to that movement. The third thing is I think that the environmental movement has to better understand, by movement I mean leaders that are the big green often, but sometimes the small green ones, the climate change movement, etc. I think they need to center a different narrative about not only the history, but how the work is not separate from social justice, but it was made to seem separate. They are one and the same. And I feel like some of us intuitively know that, right? Like we get that. But we instead keep turning to the data of how Black and brown people bear the weight of environmental pollution and so on. It's like we know this and understand that's not what white people are telling us they care about. You see it? You see it. Look at what is happening in the movement. We know the data, and it takes decades to move white-led, white-centered organizations to move on behalf of Black and brown communities suffering on climate, on environmental health, on access to nature, all of the things. It doesn't work. So we need a different kind of leadership in the field and a really different narrative. I think there's environmental groups working on this. I was just with Audubon, the national folks recently, and they're struggling through it because they have this model of like what we believe is right. And I asked them, how do you know that? And one of the things that came out of our conversation was this acknowledgement of like, we actually are failing at our mission. Not only Audubon, like everybody. And they're like, so this way we've been doing it for the past few hundred years, post the erasure of indigenous people and the exclusion and marginalization of Black and brown communities who know how to do this work, it's not working. The white-centered way of environmental protection isn't working. And once they ask that new question of how do we make it work differently, because it's not, we opened up a whole new realm of narrative and strategy. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? I don't know if we have time. No? Okay.